My father told me the uniform made me look like hired help. My mother said the smell of aviation fuel would embarrass their investors. My younger brother leaned across the kitchen island, tapped the gold invitation with one manicured finger, and said nobody important cared about another medal earned by a woman who flew ambulances. They said all of that 6 hours before an Army general pinned the Distinguished Flying Cross above my heart. They also said it 3 days before federal agents locked the doors of the company they had built with my name, my credit, and a veteran certification they had no legal right to use. But the part they never saw coming was sitting in the front row beside me. She was a 63-year-old retired crew chief named Ruth Alvarez. She wore a plain navy dress, carried a dented metal toolbox instead of a designer purse, and had grease embedded so deep in the lines of her hands that no amount of soap could remove it. My family had called her a washed-up mechanic. My brother had stolen the design she spent 11 years creating. My parents had used my deployment power of attorney to hide the theft behind my military record. And on live television, in front of the same investors my family had chosen over me, Ruth was about to receive the one thing they believed already belonged to them: a verified ownership order, a multi-million-dollar licensing agreement, and the public recognition of being the true inventor of the flight safety system my brother had claimed as his own. Less than an hour later, my phone lit up with so many calls that the dashboard of my truck looked like an emergency warning panel. My father called until his number disappeared behind a wall of notifications. My mother sent messages that shifted from threats to prayers and back to threats. My brother demanded I call the general and correct the mistake, as if a federal investigation were a dinner reservation I could change with one phone call. I placed the phone face down in the cup holder and drove through the Virginia night without answering. Before I tell you how a family can turn a daughter into a signature, a paycheck, and a shield for fraud, take a moment to like this story and subscribe. Only do it if you believe respect is measured by what people do when there is nothing left to take from you. And tell me in the comments what city you are listening from tonight. My name is Rebecca Holloway. Most people in the Army called me Beck. I was 40 years old when the whole thing finally came apart, though the damage had started before I was old enough to reach the rudder pedals in my father's crop duster. I grew up outside Wichita, Kansas, where the horizon is flat enough to make a child believe the sky belongs to everybody. My father, Dean Holloway, owned a small aviation repair shop beside a county airfield. The place had one drafty hangar, 2 tired fuel pumps, and a faded sign that said Holloway Air Service in red letters. My mother, Marla, kept the books at a desk behind the parts counter. My younger brother, Tyler, was born 4 years after me and treated like proof that the family name had finally produced the right kind of child. Father took Tyler into the hangar before he could read. He let him sit in the pilot seat and move the controls. He bought him model airplanes every Christmas. When I asked for flying lessons, Father laughed and handed me a broom. "You can learn the business from the ground," he said. I thought he meant patience. What he meant was place. Tyler belonged in the cockpit. I belonged under it, so I swept floors. I cleaned spark plugs. I held flashlights while Father changed cracked hoses. I learned the smell of overheated wiring and hydraulic fluid. I learned that a bearing can warn you before it fails if you listen carefully enough. I learned that machines are honest. They do not flatter the favorite child. They do not care who carries the family name. A loose bolt is a loose bolt no matter who is looking at it. Ruth Alvarez was the first person who noticed I understood that. She had retired from the Army after more than 30 years as a helicopter crew chief. She rented a corner of our hangar to restore an old rescue helicopter for a veterans museum. Ruth was short, broad-shouldered, and impossible to impress. She wore steel-toed boots, kept her gray hair tied in a tight braid, and carried a red inspection mirror in the breast pocket of her work shirt. The first time she spoke to me, I was 15 and kneeling under the wing of a crop duster. "What do you hear?" she asked. I listened. A dry clicking sound came from behind the panel. "The linkage is rubbing," I said. Ruth nodded once. "Then why are you holding a broom instead of a wrench?" That question changed my life. She started teaching me after school. Not kindly, not gently. Ruth believed praise should be earned and instructions should be clear. She taught me to inspect cable tension, read maintenance records, and trace an electrical fault without guessing. She also taught me the first rule of aviation: the sky does not forgive pride. My father hated how much time I spent with her. He said Ruth was filling my head with ideas. My mother said no decent man wanted a wife who came home smelling like a hanger. Tyler made airplane noises whenever I talked about joining the army. I joined anyway. At 18, I signed the papers. At 19, I learned to march. At 22, I earned my wings. By 30, I was flying medical evacuation missions in places where the maps changed faster than the weather. My family attended none of it. They missed my commissioning ceremony because Tyler had a regional flying competition. He finished ninth. They missed my flight school graduation because Mother had scheduled family photographs for Tyler's business website. They missed the day I became an instructor pilot because Father said the airfare was too expensive. The airfare was always too expensive when the destination was me. Still, I sent money home. That is the part I used to hate admitting. I was not tricked once. I was trained over time. When Father said the hangar roof needed replacing, I wired him $6,000. When Mother said payroll was short, I covered it. When Tyler crashed a rented plane during an unauthorized night flight, I paid the insurance deductible because my parents swore one public claim would destroy his future. My future, apparently, could absorb anything. During my first long deployment, Mother called to say the bank might seize the family business. She cried so hard I could barely understand her. She said 30 years of work would disappear unless someone signed temporary financial authority over to Father. I went to the legal office on base. The captain behind the desk explained the difference between a general power of attorney and a limited one. I chose a limited document. It allowed Father to make payments connected to the hangar, and only during the dates of my deployment. The captain looked directly at me before I signed. Limit the power and limit the time, she said. Trust is not a substitute for paper. I remembered the sentence. I just did not obey its meaning strongly enough. Father received the document. The roof was repaired. The business survived. At least that was what I believed. Then the requests grew. Tyler decided crop dusting and engine repair were beneath him. He wanted to build what he called a next-generation military aviation company. He wore slim suits, rented expensive cars for photographs, and filled social media with words like disruption, defense readiness, and tactical innovation. He had never served a day. He had never landed under fire. He had never watched a crew chief crawl beneath a damaged aircraft while rounds struck the dirt nearby. But he knew how to speak as if courage were a brand. He renamed the family business Holloway Tactical Aeronautics. He replaced the old red sign with brushed steel letters. He installed a glass conference room inside the hangar and bought a long black table that cost more than the engine in Father's first plane. I asked where the money came from. Family expansion, Mother said. I asked what the company actually made. Tyler sent me a glossy presentation about a portable landing guidance unit for helicopters operating in dust, smoke, and snow. The device used ground sensors and visual alerts to help pilots judge height and drift when they could not see the surface clearly. I stared at the drawings for a long time. Something about them felt familiar. Years earlier, Ruth had started building a crude system with parts from farm equipment, old radar units, and weather instruments. She called it the Lantern. The idea came after a young pilot she mentored died during a brownout landing. Ruth believed pilots needed a cheap, rugged warning system that could work where expensive aircraft upgrades were unavailable. She kept notebooks filled with diagrams. She tested components in our old hangar. She never had the money to hire a patent lawyer or build a polished prototype. She just kept improving it, one hand-drawn page at a time. Tyler's presentation looked cleaner. The language was different. The housing was modern, but the pattern of the sensors was almost identical. I called Ruth from overseas. Did you give Tyler access to the lantern, I asked? The line went quiet. I left one locked storage case at the hangar, she said. Your father promised it was safe. My stomach tightened. Have you opened it lately? Not in 2 years. I told her not to confront anyone yet. I needed facts. That was my profession speaking. By then, I was not only a pilot. I was an aviation safety officer. My work required me to review flight records, maintenance failures, risk reports, and chains of responsibility. When something went wrong, I did not start with blame. I started with documents. I asked Tyler for the engineering history. He laughed. Classified business information, he said. You fly helicopters. Let the entrepreneurs handle the company. Then he asked me to record a video in uniform. He wanted me to stand beside a helicopter and say Holloway Tactical Aeronautics was veteran-led and combat tested. He claimed investors needed confidence. He promised the video would only be used in a private presentation. I refused. That was the first time he sounded afraid. Not angry, afraid. Beck, he said, this company is built around your story. I asked what that meant. He changed the subject. For the next 2 years, my family treated every deployment as a financial season. Hazard pay arrived. Requests followed. My parents said Tyler's company needed bridge money. Tyler said a major federal opportunity was close. Mother said the whole family would be secure once the contract landed. I sent less than before, but I still sent enough to keep the machine moving. Shame can be expensive. One Christmas, I learned exactly how expensive. Our unit was stationed at a wind-blown airfield, where the holiday meal arrived in aluminum trays and tasted faintly of fuel. Someone had taped paper snowflakes to the operations wall. Daniel found a plastic tree no taller than his boot and placed it beside the weather computer. We laughed at how miserable it looked. Then Mother called. She said Tyler had been invited to a defense industry reception in Dallas. She said one conversation there could change the future of the company. He needed a new suit, airfare, a hotel room, and what she called a proper watch. I asked how much. $11,000? I thought I had heard her wrong. Mother explained that the watch was not really jewelry. It was credibility. Investors noticed details. People with money trusted people who appeared to have money. I stood beneath the paper snowflakes and looked at the tray in front of me. My Christmas dinner was powdered potatoes and turkey sliced thin enough to see light through it. Tyler needed an $11,000 costume so strangers would believe he was successful. I said no. Father called 5 minutes later. He reminded me that the family business had paid for food, school clothes, and a roof over my head when I was a child. He converted ordinary parenting into a debt statement and read it aloud as if I had signed the bottom. Then he said the sentence that always worked. Your brother has one chance. You have a steady military paycheck. I transferred the money. Tyler posted a photograph from the reception beside a retired senator and wrote that years of sacrifice were finally paying off. He never mentioned whose sacrifice. The next morning, Daniel found me sitting alone beside the helicopter before sunrise. Bad news from home, he asked. I told him it was nothing. He looked at me for a long moment. Nothing does not usually make people sit in the cold before first light, he said. I almost told him. Instead, I checked the tires again. That was another cost. Secrecy protects the people hurting you. You hide the facts because saying them aloud would force you to hear how unreasonable they are. By the time Tyler began chasing federal work, my parents had created a complete financial mythology around me. They told relatives I was an investor. They told employees I had chosen to remain silent because military ethics rules prevented public involvement. They told bankers I reviewed every major decision from overseas. None of that was true. What was true was simple. The old repair business was failing. Father had delayed taxes and vendor payments. Mother had moved balances between credit cards to keep the accounts looking alive. Tyler had spent heavily on consultants, branding, leased offices, and travel. The family needed one large contract before the bills reached the surface. The bid they wanted was worth more than $4 million over several years. To compete under a veteran-owned program, they needed a veteran who genuinely owned and controlled the business. Tyler had no veteran partner. Father had no veteran partner. They had me, or they believed they did. Mother began asking strange questions during our calls. Did I plan to leave the Army soon? Could I attend monthly meetings by video? Would I be comfortable calling myself an executive? Could I sign documents electronically while deployed? I answered vaguely because I did not understand the pattern yet. Ruth did. She called me one afternoon after seeing a new company brochure in the hangar. Your photograph is on the wall, she said. What photograph? The one from your promotion ceremony. They put a company logo under it. I felt a cold pressure behind my ribs. Take a picture, I said. Ruth sent it. There I was in uniform, standing beside an aircraft, above a caption that called me co-founder and chief operational advisor. I ordered Tyler to remove it. He said the brochure had already gone to print and promised the next version would be corrected. It never was. Instead, the photograph appeared on a new website, then in an investor deck, then beside a statement claiming the company was guided by direct combat aviation experience. Every time I objected, my family treated the objection as a technical inconvenience. Relax, Tyler said. Nobody thinks you are making sales calls from Iraq. Your credibility gets us in the room. My team does the work. That was the center of his entire plan. He wanted the value of my service without the control of my judgment. He wanted my biography to open the door, then wanted me to remain far enough away that I could not see what passed through it. You pay because you do not want to admit the people you love are using you. You call it helping, you call it loyalty, you call it temporary. Anything sounds better than the truth. The truth reached me in northern Iraq on a night so dark the mountains looked cut out of black paper. Our medical crew had been sent to recover soldiers wounded at a remote observation post. A sandstorm was building from the west. The air tasted like metal. Visibility dropped every minute. I was flying a Black Hawk with Chief Warrant Officer Daniel Cho in the other seat. Staff Sergeant Aaron Walsh worked the cabin. We had already turned away once because enemy fire crossed the approach path. Then, the radio crackled with a medic's voice. They had 2 men bleeding badly. One had a chest injury. The other had lost part of a leg. Ground evacuation would take hours they did not have. Daniel looked at me. "Your call," he said. The safe decision was to wait. The right decision was to go. We climbed behind a ridge, descended into a narrow valley, and approached from the east. Dust swallowed the landing zone. Tracer fire appeared through the haze like red needles. Our warning panel flashed. The aircraft shook as rounds struck the tail section. I could not see the ground. Then I remembered Ruth's lantern. Not the device itself, the principle. Do not chase the dust, she used to say. Trust stable references. Build a picture from more than one signal. I used the radar altimeter, the drift cues, Daniel's callouts, and the faint line of a stone wall on my left. We descended 1 careful foot at a time. The wheels touched hard. Aaron pulled the wounded aboard. The first man was barely conscious. The second kept asking whether his squad had made it out. Enemy fire tightened around us. A round entered through the side panel and shattered part of the instrument console. Another tore through my right forearm. The pain felt hot and blunt, like being struck with a hammer wrapped in fire. Daniel asked if I could fly. I moved my fingers. Blood ran into my glove. "I can fly," I said. We lifted with the cabin lights dimmed and the storm closing behind us. Halfway back, the hydraulics began to fluctuate. Daniel handled the emergency checklist while I held the aircraft steady. Aaron worked on the wounded in the dark. The man with the chest injury stopped breathing twice. She brought him back twice. We landed at the field hospital with almost no hydraulic pressure left. The wounded survived. I remember that because it mattered more than anything that happened next. A medic cut away my sleeve. The bullet had passed through the outer muscle of my forearm without breaking bone. I was lucky. The aircraft was not. Maintenance found damage in the tail, flight controls, and hydraulic lines. While a surgeon cleaned the wound, my phone began vibrating on a steel table. Tyler. I ignored the first call. He called again, then mother, then father. The surgeon told me not to move. I answered on speaker. Tyler did not ask why hospital lights were above me. He did not ask about the blood on my sleeve. He said a document had been sent to my military email and I needed to sign it immediately. "What document?" I asked. "A board consent," he said. "Routine paperwork. We have investors in town. If you delay, you could cost this family everything." I asked why I was listed on a board I had never joined. Silence. Then father came on the line. "Stop making trouble," he said. "We used the authority you gave us. You own the controlling share. That is good for you." The surgeon paused and looked at me. I felt the room become very still. "What controlling share?" I asked. Mother answered this time. "Do not be dramatic, Rebecca. The company needed to qualify for veteran programs. Your name opened the right doors. Tyler runs everything. You only need to sign." I stared at the ceiling. My blood pressure monitor began beeping faster. They had not simply used my money. They had used my identity. I asked Tyler to explain the document. He became impatient. "It guarantees the new credit line," he said. $680,000. The federal subcontract pays next quarter. Once that money clears, the loan disappears. The surgeon stopped working. Even she understood the number. I asked what secured the credit line. Father said the hangar, my ownership interest, and a personal guarantee. My personal guarantee. A guarantee I had never signed. I told them I had been shot less than 2 hours earlier. Mother sighed as if I had mentioned bad weather. "You are in a hospital," she said. "That means you are safe. Tyler's investors are waiting in a hotel suite. Please try to understand which emergency is real. Something inside me changed so quietly that none of them heard it. For years, I had believed there was a locked door between me and my family's love. I thought money might open it, achievement might open it, obedience might open it. There was no door. There was only a wall they charged me to stand beside. I told them I would review the document. Tyler relaxed. Good, he said. Sign before midnight. I ended the call. Then I asked the surgeon to bring my uniform jacket closer. My government laptop was in the inside compartment. She told me to rest. I told her rest could wait 15 minutes. The document Tyler sent was not routine. It was a written consent naming me as majority owner and chair of Holloway Tactical Aeronautics. It approved a credit line, confirmed a federal contracting certification, and stated that I controlled daily business decisions. Every sentence was false. Attached to it was a copy of a power of attorney with my signature. The document looked like the limited one I had signed years earlier, but the page describing its limits had been replaced. The version attached to Tyler's email gave Father broad authority over banking, business formation, loans, and property. Someone had altered it. I opened my credit report. There were inquiries from banks in Kansas and Virginia. There was a business account linked to my Social Security number. There was a line of credit already open. There were payments I had never authorized. Then I searched the federal contractor database. Holloway Tactical Aeronautics was registered as a veteran-owned small business. The certification listed me as the veteran who owned and controlled more than half the company. I was deployed thousands of miles away. I had never attended a meeting. I had never received a profit distribution. I had never approved a bid. Yet my biography appeared in their marketing materials. Major Rebecca Holloway, combat aviator, aviation safety expert, majority owner. They had turned my service into a costume they could wear to the bank. I called Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Price, an Army lawyer I trusted. Naomi had a calm voice and the unsettling habit of becoming more polite when she was angry. She listened without interrupting. Then she asked me to forward everything. A power of attorney can be revoked while you are mentally competent, she said. But revocation does not erase what someone already did. We have to notify every institution, preserve the records, and separate valid acts from fraud. She paused. And Rebecca, do not warn them again. Why? Because people destroy evidence when they learn the door is closing. That sentence gave me a mission. I signed a written revocation. Naomi sent notices to the banks, the company, the state filing office, and the contracting officials connected to the certification. I froze my credit. I changed passwords. I removed every family member from my financial accounts and emergency contacts. I preserved emails, text messages, voicemails, and bank records. Then I called Ruth. Open your storage case, I said. She drove to the hangar before sunrise Kansas time. Father had changed the lock on the side door, but Ruth still had access through the museum restoration agreement. She entered with a local Veterans Museum director as a witness. The case was there, the notebooks were gone. So was the prototype sensor head. Ruth did not cry. She became quiet in the way mechanics become quiet when they find damage that could have killed someone. I made copies, she said. Where? A safe deposit box. And I mailed sealed copies of the design to myself years ago. The postmarks are still intact. That was Ruth. She trusted people, but she trusted records more. Naomi connected us with a civilian lawyer who handled intellectual property and federal procurement. His name was Martin Keene. He spoke slowly, as if every word had an hourly rate. He reviewed Ruth's notebooks, photographs, test logs, and dated correspondence. He reviewed Tyler's patent filing and marketing presentation. Then he said the sentence that turned fear into direction. Your brother did not invent around her work. He copied the spine and changed the skin. Martin also explained the contracting problem. A business claiming veteran ownership had to be genuinely owned and controlled by the veteran. A paper percentage was not enough if someone else made every decision. False statements tied to government money could trigger suspension, repayment, civil penalties, and a fraud investigation. Do not celebrate yet, he said. Truth wins slowly. I understood slow. Flying in bad weather teaches you that panic is only speed without judgment. The investigation began while I healed. The first 48 hours taught me how quickly a lie becomes aggressive when documents threaten it. Tyler sent me a voice message saying he had already told investors my refusal was caused by pain medication. Father emailed a statement for me to sign declaring that I had approved the company structure years earlier and simply forgotten. Mother contacted an Army family support office and claimed I was emotionally unstable after combat. She hoped someone in my chain of command would pressure me to cooperate. Instead, Colonel Grant asked me to meet him in a secure office. Naomi joined by video. I placed every record on the table: the altered power of attorney, the company filings, the bank inquiries, the marketing pages, the messages demanding my signature while I was being treated for a gunshot wound. Colonel Grant read in silence. When he finished, he closed the folder carefully. "Your family may try to make this look like a personal disagreement," he said. "Keep doing what you are doing. Facts, channels, no retaliation." I asked whether the investigation would damage my career. He leaned back. "Being the victim of fraud is not misconduct. Hiding it could become a security problem. Reporting it was the correct decision." I had not realized how badly I needed to hear that. People who exploit family loyalty often make exposure feel like betrayal. They reverse the moral weight. The person who steals becomes the keeper of peace. The person who speaks becomes the destroyer. Colonel Grant returned the folder. "Do not let them assign you their shame," he said. Federal contracting officials requested corporate records. The bank froze. Further draws on the credit line. Tyler sent increasingly desperate messages asking me to call the whole thing a misunderstanding. Mother left voicemails about family privacy. Father said I was betraying the business that raised me. I answered none of them. 2 weeks later, I returned to limited flight duty. The aircraft from our rescue mission sat in a maintenance bay with panels removed. I walked around it slowly. The right side was scarred with bullet damage. Dried dust remained in places the wash crew had missed. My blood had left a dark mark near the seat rail. Daniel stood beside me. "You should have turned around," he said. I looked at him. He smiled. "I am glad you did not." The official review found that our crew had saved 7 wounded soldiers and 2 local interpreters. The man with the chest wound lived. The soldier who lost part of his leg later sent Aaron a photograph of himself standing on a prosthetic beside his daughter. I did not know anyone had submitted me for an award until my commander called me into his office. Colonel Isaac Grant placed a folder on his desk. "Your crew will be recognized," he said. "You are receiving the Distinguished Flying Cross." I looked at the folder but did not touch it. "For what?" He raised one eyebrow. "For flying a damaged aircraft into a landing zone under fire, taking a wound, refusing evacuation, and bringing 9 people home alive." I thought about the call from my family in the field hospital. I thought about Mother saying Tyler's investors were the real emergency. Colonel Grant watched my face. "There is a ceremony at the National Museum of the United States Army," he said. "It will be broadcast. You have 2 seats for family." Family. The word no longer meant what it once had. By then, the investigation had been running for 3 months. Tyler's federal subcontract had been suspended before any major payment was released. The bank was demanding additional collateral. Investors were asking why the supposed majority owner had never attended a board meeting. Ruth's legal claim had survived the first challenge, and an independent engineering panel had confirmed that her dated design records came before Tyler's filing. Martin said a private aviation safety foundation wanted to support Ruth's work. A group of manufacturers had reviewed the lantern concept and believed it could save lives in wildfire zones, dust landings, and rural rescue operations. They were negotiating a licensing agreement, but no announcement would happen until ownership was formally secured. The final decision arrived the same week as my award invitation. Tyler's patent application was suspended pending review. Ruth was recognized in the settlement as the original inventor. Holloway Tactical Aeronautics agreed to surrender every claim to the design in exchange for the government not seeking an emergency injunction against all company assets while the broader investigation continued. My family did not know the licensing agreement was complete. They only knew their contract was delayed. They still believed they could pressure me into repairing everything. I flew home to Kansas, with my arms still stiff from the wound. I wore civilian clothes and carried the 2 gold-edged invitations in a plain folder. The old hangar looked different. The brushed steel company sign reflected the afternoon sun. A row of rented luxury vehicles stood outside. Inside, workers were hanging banners for Tyler's investor gala at a hotel in downtown Wichita. The banners showed his face above the words "Vision Beyond the Battlefield." He had never seen a battlefield. Father stood near the conference room wearing a new sport coat. Mother was arranging gift boxes. Tyler was practicing a speech in front of a camera. None of them asked about my arm. Mother looked at my plain shirt and frowned. "You could have dressed better," she said. "Reporters may come by." I placed the invitations on the black conference table. "The Army is awarding me the Distinguished Flying Cross on Friday," I said. "These are front row seats." Tyler stopped practicing. For 1 second, I saw concern cross his face. Not pride, calculation. "Friday is the investor dinner," he said. "I know. You need to be there." I asked why. He glanced at Father. "Because the investors want to meet the majority owner." I let the silence sit between us. Mother stepped closer. "Rebecca, this is the moment we have all worked for. Tyler has built something important. Your medal is wonderful, but military ceremonies happen all the time. This dinner could save the company." I looked at Father. He picked up one invitation, turned it over, and set it down again. "A flying medal," he said. "They give those to crews, do they not?" "Not this one," I said. He shrugged. "You did your job." Tyler laughed softly. "And honestly, Beck, the uniform is a problem for the dinner. The investors are buying technology, not war stories. You come in with that stiff posture and those scars, and the whole room feels like a memorial service." Mother touched my sleeve near the wound. "Aviation fuel never leaves your clothes," she said. "It is not the image we need." There it was. Not rage, not shouting, something cleaner and colder. They wanted the authority of my uniform without the sight of the person who wore it. Father pushed the invitations back toward me. "We will not sit in a museum and clap because you managed not to crash," he said. "We have serious people to impress." I looked at each of them. "You are choosing Tyler's dinner." Mother rolled her eyes. "Do not make this childish." I picked up the invitations. "I am not making anything," I said. "I am only confirming it." Tyler stepped in front of me before I could leave. "You still need to sign the board consent," he said quietly. "No." His face tightened. "You cannot walk away from a company you own." "I never owned it." Father moved toward us. "We have documents. So do I." The color left Tyler's face. For the first time, he understood that I knew more than he had told me. Mother tried another approach. "Whatever confusion exists, we can solve it privately. After the dinner, families protect one another." I looked at her hand on my sleeve and removed it. Families do not forge one another. No one spoke. The hangar seemed to expand around us. Even the workers stopped moving. I turned toward the side door. Father called after me. "If you embarrass Tyler, do not come back." I stopped with my hand on the metal bar. I had heard versions of that threat my entire life. Obey or lose us. Pay or lose us. Lie or lose us. The threat only works while you believe losing them is worse than losing yourself. I opened the door. "You already left me years ago," I said. "I am just the last person to admit it." I walked outside. The Kansas wind carried the smell of cut grass and jet fuel across the field. For once, the smell did not feel like shame. It felt like evidence that I had survived. I called Ruth from the parking lot. She answered on the first ring. "Did they accept?" she asked. "No." I heard her breathe out. "I am sorry. Do not be," I said. "Pack a dress." Ruth laughed. "I own one dress. It makes me look like a church usher." "Then wear it proudly." "I have a better idea," she said. "I will wear my old blue suit, the one I used when I testified after the crash inquiry. That was perfect." Ruth had worn that suit 11 years earlier when she told a room full of officers that poor visibility was not an excuse to stop improving equipment. She had been ignored, thanked politely, and sent home. Afterward, she began building the lantern. She arrived in Virginia 2 days later carrying a small suitcase and the dented toolbox. Airport security had made her check the tools, which offended her more than the flight delay. "Why did you bring a toolbox to an award ceremony?" I asked. "Because every expensive building has one loose screw," she said. That was Ruth's humor, dry enough to start a grass fire. Naomi met us for dinner near the museum. She brought Martin Keene and a representative from the Aviation Safety Foundation. The representative's name was Helen Ward. She was a former test pilot with silver hair and a voice that made everyone else lower theirs. Helen placed a leather folder on the table. "The ownership settlement is final," she told Ruth. The manufacturers have signed the licensing agreement. The Foundation Board approved the first phase of funding. Ruth stared at the folder. How much? She asked. The initial payment is $3,200,000. There are royalties on every unit produced. The agreement also creates a training and testing center under your name. Ruth did not move. Helen continued, We want the center near Wichita. You choose the site. The program will train military, wildfire, medical, and rural rescue crews. Your design remains yours. Ruth looked at me. I had seen people receive casualty news. I had seen people wake after surgery. I had seen soldiers realize they were going home. The look on Ruth's face held pieces of all three. Why announce it at Rebecca's ceremony, she asked. Because the Army aviation community asked to recognize the connection between the pilot who trusted the principal and the mechanic who built it, Helen said. And because sunlight is useful when someone has tried to steal your work, Naomi slid another document across the table. There is more. The Federal Contracting Office had completed an emergency responsibility review. Holloway Tactical Aeronautics was being suspended from new federal awards. Its veteran certification was revoked. The matter had been referred for investigation because the company had represented that I owned and controlled it when I did not. Naomi spoke carefully. A referral is not a conviction. The process will take time, but the company cannot use your status anymore, and the bank has been notified that your personal guarantee is disputed as a forgery. I asked whether my parents knew. They will receive formal notice tomorrow morning, Naomi said. During the ceremony, I said. She looked at her watch. Very close to it. Ruth leaned back in her chair. They are holding the investor dinner at the Broadmoor Hall, she said. Helen nodded. One of the manufacturers at their dinner is also part of our licensing group. Their legal team knows the truth. They will not be investing. The trap was not something I had designed for revenge. It was simply timing. For years, my family had lived by controlling the moment when information arrived. They called during deployments. They demanded signatures under pressure. They hid documents until deadlines. They used urgency to stop questions. Now the truth had its own schedule, and they could not move it. The ceremony began on Friday evening. The National Museum of the United States Army glowed against the dark sky. Inside, the main hall was filled with soldiers, veterans, families, journalists, and aviation crews. Helicopters and armored vehicles stood in the shadows above us like witnesses from another age. Ruth sat in the front row wearing her old blue suit. The fabric was slightly shiny at the elbows. Her service ribbons rested above her left pocket. She held the dented toolbox on the floor between her shoes. I wore my dress uniform. The wound in my arm pulled when I moved, but the pain kept me present. Colonel Grant stood near the stage. Daniel and Aaron sat with our crew. Naomi was several rows back beside Martin. Helen waited near the wings. The cameras turned on. A general named Samuel Mercer walked to the podium. He had flown helicopters before I entered high school. His voice carried without effort. He described the rescue mission. He did not decorate it with poetry. He gave facts. A medical crew entered a landing zone under enemy fire. Visibility was nearly gone. The aircraft took repeated damage. 9 wounded people were evacuated. The pilot was shot and continued the mission. The crew landed with a failing hydraulic system. Then he said my name. I stood. The room rose with me. For a second, I could not move. Not because I was afraid of the stage, because every empty chair from my past seemed to rise inside my chest. Flight school, commissioning, promotions, departures, returns. The family seats had always been empty, even when my parents were physically present in my life. Then Ruth looked up at me. She did not smile. She gave me the small nod crew chiefs give pilots when an aircraft is ready. Go. I walked to the stage. General Mercer pinned the Distinguished Flying Cross to my uniform. The metal was lighter than I expected. The memory behind it was not. I saw the wounded soldier asking about his squad. I saw Aaron's hands working in the dark. I saw Daniel holding the emergency checklist while the controls fought us. I heard Ruth teaching a teenage girl not to chase the dust. The general saluted. I returned it. Applause filled the hall. I did not look for my parents. I knew exactly where they were. Across the country, in a ballroom filled with glass chandeliers and least confidence, my family was presenting Tyler as the future of military aviation. They had expected investors to watch him on a stage. Instead, the ballroom screens had been tuned to the national broadcast of my ceremony because Tyler wanted guests to see his famous military connection before he spoke. He had planned to use my medal as background decoration. He did not know the broadcast had another chapter. General Mercer returned to the podium after I sat down. Tonight, he said, we are honoring not only courage in flight, but the quiet work that makes courage possible. Ruth looked at me. I reached down and touched the handle of her toolbox. General Mercer spoke about maintenance crews, engineers, instructors, and families who protect lives without appearing in photographs. Then, he described a rescue landing system developed over 11 years by a retired Army crew chief. The hall became completely still. He told the story of a preventable crash, a mechanic who refused to accept that poor visibility had to remain a permanent killer, a prototype built from used parts, notebooks preserved when money ran out, a design taken without permission and returned through records, witnesses, and law. Ruth's breathing changed. General Mercer looked toward the front row. Ruth Alvarez, please stand. She did not. Her knees seemed to forget their job. I stood first and offered my hand. She looked at it. I spent half my career pulling pilots out of bad decisions, she whispered. I suppose I can stand up for one good one. She took my hand. The spotlight found her. The hall rose again. If you have ever watched someone else take credit for your sacrifice, this is the moment I want you to remember. Stay with me, because what happened next was not charity. It was ownership returning to the hands that earned it. And if that truth means something to you, leave the words, rightful hands, in the comments. Helen Ward stepped onto the stage, carrying the leather folder. Behind her, a large screen displayed the lantern system mounted beside a rescue helicopter landing in a cloud of dust. General Mercer announced the agreement. The Aviation Safety Foundation and a manufacturing group had entered a licensing partnership with Ruth as the verified inventor. The first payment would fund production, testing, and the creation of the Ruth Alvarez Flight Safety Center in Kansas. Royalties would remain with Ruth for the life of the agreement. Scholarships would train mechanics and pilots from rural rescue agencies that could not afford advanced equipment. Then Helen announced the amount, $3,200,000 in the first phase. A sound moved through the audience, not shouting, a collective breath. Ruth covered her mouth. The general was not finished. The center would also receive a long-term site lease at a restored airfield, equipment from participating manufacturers, and an endowment for apprentices from military families. Ruth began to cry, not the theatrical crying my mother used when a bank transfer was late. These were silent tears. They slid down a face that had spent decades in wind, heat, and rotor wash. She carried the toolbox to the stage. Helen offered the leather folder. Ruth accepted it with both hands. Then she placed the dented toolbox on the podium. I brought the first sensor housing, she said into the microphone. It is ugly, but it works. The room laughed softly. Ruth opened the box. Inside rested a small metal unit with scratches along the casing. The original lantern. For years, my brother had shown investors polished renderings and claimed he had invented a revolution. Ruth had brought the actual machine. General Mercer asked her to say a few words. Ruth looked out at the crowd. Mechanics do not make miracles, she said. We make fewer excuses. A pilot should not die because the useful answer was not fashionable enough to fund. She turned toward me. And a girl should not be handed a broom when she has the hands to fly. That sentence broke something open inside me. I had spent years proving my father wrong. I had never admitted how badly I wanted someone to remember the girl under the wing. Ruth remembered. The audience rose for the third time. In the ballroom in Wichita, the same sentence traveled through the speakers above my family's investor tables. I learned later what happened there from 3 separate witnesses and one very clear security recording. Tyler had been standing behind a podium with a photograph of my helicopter on the screen. Father sat near the front. Mother wore a silver gown and had arranged place cards beside every investor. When Ruth's name was announced, Tyler stopped smiling. When the licensing agreement appeared, one manufacturer at the table closed his presentation folder. When the true history of the design was explained, another investor stood and walked out. Then Tyler's phone received the formal notice. The federal veteran certification was revoked, new awards were suspended, his patent claim had been surrendered, The bank had frozen the remaining line of credit. The personal guarantee carrying my name was under fraud review. Tyler tried to continue his speech. The microphone was still live when he whispered to Father that everything was gone. Mother crossed the ballroom toward the television and demanded the hotel shut off the broadcast. A technician told her the investor group had requested it remain on. Then Ruth raised the original lantern from her toolbox. The ballroom saw the machine Tyler had pretended did not exist. That was the moment the dinner ended. Investors left before dessert. Reporters waiting for a business announcement began asking about forged ownership records. The rented luxury vehicles outside the hotel became a line of evidence instead of success. My family had spent years using my absence as a tool. Now my absence from their ballroom told the truth more loudly than any speech. After the ceremony, people surrounded Ruth. Pilots wanted to shake her hand. Mechanics wanted photographs with the toolbox. A widow whose husband had died in a dust landing held Ruth for nearly a minute without speaking. I stood at the edge of the crowd. Colonel Grant came beside me. "You all right?" he asked. I looked at Ruth. For the first time in my life, yes. My phone began vibrating inside my uniform pocket. I checked the screen. Father, Mother, Tyler, then Father again. Within 10 minutes, there were more than 30 calls. Naomi glanced at the screen. "Do not answer tonight," she said. I had no intention of answering ever. But people like my family do not believe a boundary until they collide with it. Ruth and I left through a side entrance. The air outside was cold and clean. She carried the leather folder under one arm and the toolbox in the other. I offered to carry both. She handed me the folder and kept the tools. "Some things are not transferable," she said. We drove to a quiet hotel in Alexandria where the foundation had reserved rooms. Halfway there, the truck connected to my phone, the dashboard filled with messages. "You destroyed us. Call the bank. Tell them you approved everything. Ruth stole our contract. We made you. This is family property." One message from Mother simply said that Father was having chest pain, and it would be my fault if something happened. I called emergency services in Kansas and requested a welfare check. Then I blocked her number. That was the difference between cruelty and a boundary. I would not ignore a possible medical emergency. I also would not reopen the door to manipulation. At the hotel, Ruth went upstairs. I remained in the parking garage for a few minutes, letting the engine idle. The calls stopped. I thought the night was over. It was not. When I reached my apartment building, Tyler's rented sports car was parked across 2 spaces near the entrance. Father and Mother stood beside it. Tyler paced near the lobby doors. They had taken the first flight from Kansas. I stayed inside my truck and called building security. Then I called Naomi. "Do not meet them alone," she said. I looked through the windshield. They had already seen me. Father walked toward the truck with both hands raised, as if he were the reasonable one. Mother followed. Tyler reached the driver's door first and struck the glass with his palm. "Get out," he shouted. I kept the door locked. "Security is coming," I said through the closed window. Mother pressed both hands together beneath her chin. "Rebecca, please. We only need 5 minutes." Father pointed toward the passenger door. "Open the truck. We are not criminals." The building guard arrived with another officer. They told my family to step away from the vehicle. Tyler refused. "This is a family dispute," he said. The guard looked at me. "Do you want them on the property?" "No." The answer came out without effort. The guard directed them toward the sidewalk. Tyler shouted that he had nowhere else to go. Mother began crying. Father demanded respect. I exited the truck only after they had moved 20 feet away and the guard stood between us. Father called my name. I stopped. Naomi had told me not to discuss the investigation. Martin had told me not to threaten, accuse, or negotiate. Every useful path required restraint, so I listened. Father began with anger. "You signed the power of attorney," he said. "You gave me authority. I gave you limited authority to pay hangar expenses during one deployment. You benefited from the company. I never received money. Your name created value. My service created value. You took it." Mother stepped forward. "We were trying to save what your grandfather built." "My grandfather built a repair shop," I said. Tyler built a lie. Tyler pushed past them until the guard raised one hand. "Ruth's system was sitting in our hangar," he said. "Father paid rent on that building. Anything inside belonged to the company." I almost laughed. That was his defense. Not that he invented it, not that he had permission, only that the box was nearby. Mother changed tactics. "We can make this right," she said. "Sign a statement that you approve the ownership structure. The veteran certification can be restored. Tyler can license the design from Ruth. Everybody wins. Ruth already owns it, I said. Then make her share. No. Father's face hardened. You would choose that mechanic over your own blood. I looked at the three of them standing under the harsh parking lot lights. Ruth taught me without charging me for love. She wrote when I was deployed. She remembered every mission date. She saved records because she knew truth needs protection. You remembered me when a payment was due. Mother shook her head violently. That is not fair. Fair would have been stopping after the first dollar, I said. I gave you years. Tyler's voice dropped. If the fraud case moves forward, I could go to prison. The fear in his face was real. For one moment, I saw the boy who used to follow father around the hangar. The boy who learned that consequences were things other people absorbed for him. I did not enjoy his fear. I simply refused to carry it. You need a lawyer, I said. I need my sister. You needed my signature. He flinched. Father stepped closer to the guard. We are leaving with a solution tonight. No, I said. You are leaving with notice. I removed an envelope from my uniform bag. Naomi had prepared it after the ceremony in case my family confronted me. The letter stated that all future communication had to go through counsel. It demanded the return of my personal records and prohibited use of my name, image, service history, or military status in company materials. It also warned that appearing at my residence again could lead to a trespass order. I handed the envelope to the guard, who passed it to Father. Father tore it open. He read the first page and looked up. You planned this. I prepared for you. Mother stopped crying. Her face became empty. So that is it, she said. After everything we sacrificed, I thought about my childhood under the crop duster. The broom, the empty graduations, the transfers, the forged document, the hospital call. Name one sacrifice you made for me, I said. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Tyler kicked the tire of his rented car. The alarm began chirping. He cursed and struck it again. The guards moved forward. My family finally left. Father drove. Mother sat rigidly in the passenger seat. Tyler turned around in the back and stared at me through the rear window until the car disappeared around the corner. I expected relief. What came first was grief. Boundaries do not erase the family you wish you had. They only stop the family you do have from causing new damage. I went upstairs, removed my uniform, and placed the medal on the kitchen table. Then I sat on the floor with my back against the cabinet and cried for the girl who had kept sweeping because she believed someone might eventually hand her a wrench. The next morning, Ruth knocked on my door carrying coffee and 2 breakfast sandwiches. She saw my face and said nothing. She sat on the floor beside me. After a while, she opened her toolbox and removed the red inspection mirror she had carried when I was young. This is yours now, she said. I held it in my palm. Why? Because you finally inspected the part you were afraid to look behind? I laughed through the last of the tears. That was the beginning of the clean part of my life. The legal process was not fast. Martin had warned us, and he was right. Investigators examined bank records, company filings, emails, loan documents, certification statements, and Tyler's patent materials. Handwriting and document specialists compared the altered power of attorney with the original. The notary stamp on one page belonged to a man who had been out of the country on the date listed. Security footage showed Father presenting the document at a bank. Emails showed Tyler instructing an employee never to contact me directly because I was too busy overseas. My family tried every explanation. They said I had verbally approved the arrangement. They said military communication problems caused confusion. They said I had donated my ownership to help the family. They said Ruth had abandoned the lantern. Records answered each lie. The bank removed me from the disputed guarantee after its fraud review. The credit line became immediately due from the actual borrowers. Holloway Tactical Aeronautics could not pay. The federal suspension became a formal debarment period after the administrative process concluded. The company lost access to the contract pipeline Tyler had advertised. A civil case sought repayment of funds connected to false claims and false certifications. The criminal investigation continued separately. Tyler eventually accepted a plea agreement involving conspiracy, false statements, and identity-related fraud. Father accepted responsibility for presenting altered documents and participating in the loan scheme. Neither received the dramatic punishment people imagine from television, but both received consequences they could not transfer to me. There were restitution orders, probation conditions, home confinement for father due to his health, and a period in federal custody for Tyler. Mother was not charged with forging the documents, but financial records showed she had moved money through accounts used to hide the source. She settled the civil claims against her, lost most of the assets she had protected, and agreed never to represent any connection to Ruth's design. The hanger was sold. The week before the auction, father sent one final message through his attorney. He offered to withdraw every accusation against me if I purchased the property and leased it back to him for $1 a year. He called it a practical solution that would preserve the family legacy. Martin read the proposal and removed his glasses. Your father still believes your boundaries are a negotiation opening, he said. I declined without a counteroffer. The family legacy father wanted to preserve was not the repair shop my grandfather built. That place had been useful, modest, and honest. What father wanted to preserve was the belief that I would always absorb the final loss. If the roof leaked, I paid. If Tyler failed, I paid. If a forged company collapsed, I was expected to buy the wreckage and hand it back. For the first time, the loss remained with the people who created it. I drove to Kansas for the auction, not because I wanted to watch them lose it, because Ruth's new foundation wanted the original West Bay where the lantern had been built. The property had been divided. The polished conference room, black table, and brushed steel sign were sold to strangers. The older section of the hangar went to the Aviation Safety Foundation through a separate purchase. Ruth stood beside me when the new sign arrived. It read Alvarez Flight Safety Center. The letters were simple blue enamel. No slogans. No photographs. Ruth touched the edge of the sign. Too clean, she said. Give it a week. The center opened the following spring. The first class included Army mechanics, wildfire helicopter crews, rural emergency pilots, and community college students. Ruth insisted every student begin with inspection basics. No one touched the advanced system until they could identify a damaged cable, contaminated fitting, and false maintenance entry. The sky does not forgive pride, she told them. I stood at the back of the classroom holding the red inspection mirror. She looked directly at me when she said it. The lantern entered field testing that summer. The first operational units went to wildfire crews in the western states and medical helicopters serving remote communities. Ruth's licensing money gave her comfort, but she did not buy a mansion or a fleet of cars. She bought the small farmhouse beside the airfield. She repaired the porch. She planted tomatoes. She created a scholarship for daughters of enlisted mechanics. Then she did something I never expected. She placed the controlling interest of the training center into a permanent trust. The trust required that no single family member, investor, or company could sell the design or use the center as personal collateral. Mechanics, pilots, and rescue workers held seats on the governing board. No one gets to turn this into a throne, she said. I understood exactly what she meant. My own career changed after the award. The Army assigned me to a flight safety and training command. I still flew, but I also taught crews how to make decisions when visibility disappeared and pressure increased. I used the family story carefully. I never named them in class. I described the pattern instead. Urgency without transparency, authority without limits, trust without records. Those were hazards in a cockpit, a contract, or a home. Daniel became an instructor beside me. Aaron entered a physician assistant program. The wounded soldier with the prosthetic leg visited our unit with his daughter. She was 8 years old and wore a plastic flight helmet that kept slipping over her eyes. He shook my hand and said thank you. I told him the crew brought him home. He looked toward his daughter. You brought all of us home, he said. For a long time, I thought being useful was the closest I would ever come to being loved. Ruth taught me the difference. Love does not require you to disappear inside usefulness. 2 years after the ceremony, I received a letter forwarded through Martin's office. It was from Mother. The letter did not ask for money. That surprised me enough to keep reading. She wrote that Father had sold most of what he owned to meet restitution. Tyler was working in a warehouse after release and attending required counseling. She said the small rental house was quiet. She said quiet had forced her to remember things she had spent years avoiding. Then she apologized. Not perfectly. She still explained too much. She still blamed fear, debt, and Father. But She named several things clearly. She admitted she had treated my service as an asset. She admitted she had asked me for help while ignoring my injuries. She admitted she had preferred Tyler's comfort over my safety. At the bottom, she wrote that she did not expect forgiveness or contact. I read the letter twice. Then I placed it in a drawer. I did not call her. Some apologies are evidence of change. Others are only the beginning of possible change. Time has to tell the difference. 6 months later, another letter came. No request. A year later, a third. Still no request. I sent one sentence through Martin. I received your letters. Continue the work without expecting access. That was all. Forgiveness is not a gate pass. Compassion is not restored authority. My life did not become smaller without my family inside it. It became accurate. Sunday dinners moved to Ruth's farmhouse. Naomi brought pecan pie. Martin complained about the coffee and drank 3 cups. Daniel grilled too much meat. Aaron corrected everyone's medical stories. Students from the center sometimes joined us. The table was mismatched and loud. No one asked for my banking password. No one cared whether my uniform smelled like fuel. One autumn evening, Ruth led me into the original hangar bay after everyone had gone home. The restored rescue helicopter sat beneath new lights. Beside it stood the first production model of the lantern. A brass plate had been mounted on the casing. I expected it to carry Ruth's name. Instead, it read, "For every crew trying to find the ground when the world disappears." Below that was a smaller line, "And for the girl who listened before anyone let her fly." I stared at the words until they blurred. Ruth pretended to inspect a tool cabinet so I would have privacy. "You did that," I said. "I approved it," she replied. "That is not the same thing. Close enough for government work." I laughed. Then she reached into the cabinet and pulled out an old broom. The handle was worn smooth. My name had been scratched into the wood when I was a teenager. The museum volunteers found it behind a wall during renovation. Ruth handed it to me. I held the broom in one hand and the red inspection mirror in the other. The 2 objects contained my whole life, the place they assigned me, and the way I learned to see beyond it. Ruth opened the helicopter door. "Come on, Major," she said. "We have a sunrise flight." I placed the broom against the wall, not in anger, not in shame. I simply did not need to carry it anymore. We rolled the aircraft out before dawn. The Kansas sky slowly changed from black to deep blue. Ruth sat in the other seat wearing a headset over her gray braid. Her hands rested calmly in her lap. I started the engines. The rotors gathered speed. Dust moved across the concrete in widening circles. For a moment, the airfield disappeared inside the cloud. The lantern display came alive. Stable height, stable drift, clear path. I raised the collective and lifted through the dust. The horizon opened in front of us. My family once believed my uniform was useful only when they could borrow its authority. They believed my love was alone, without a limit. They believed blood gave them ownership over whatever I earned, survived, or became. They were wrong. A boundary did not destroy my family. It revealed where family had already ended. The people who remained did not share my last name. They shared risk, truth, work, and responsibility. They were the ones who preserved the records, tightened the bolts, answered the late call, and stood in the front row without needing a reward. Real family does not ask you to prove love by signing away your future. Real family helps you see the ground when the world disappears. Ruth looked across the cockpit as the first sunlight reached the windshield. "What do you hear?" she asked. The same question she had asked when I was 15. I listened to the engines, the rotor rhythm, and the clean, steady tone of the lantern. "Everything is working," I said. Ruth nodded. "Then fly." And I did.